Okay, everybody, it is time for another episode of The Nostalgia Trap. Thanks so much for joining me. My name is David Parsons. I am ready to bring you another great conversation. My guest today is Keri Leigh Merritt. She is a historian, a professor, someone who writes a lot about the Civil War and race, class, inequality in America. Really great work. Her most recent book is called Masterless Men, Poor Whites and Slavery in the Antebellum South. And she's also got a volume, edited volume out right now called Reconsidering Southern Labor History, Race, Class, and Power, edited with Matthew Heald and Keri Leigh Merritt. So both of those works you should check out. You know, we've been talking a lot lately about this kind of concept of the Civil War, the ideas of the South, and how those things fit into the larger historical framework that we're trying to build here on the Nostalgia Trap. And Keri's work is absolutely vital because her work talks about the position of poor whites in the South before the Civil War, during the Civil War, and during Reconstruction, and how that kind of identity plays a very particular role within the larger ideas of capitalism. So really, really fun talking to her. Really important stuff. I think it links up well for our 20th century historians. Her stuff links up really well with Bruce Schulman's work, who was a guest on the show several episodes ago. Go back in the archives, nostalgiatrap.com. Check out the Bruce Schulman episode, where we talked about this kind of reddening of America and this idea of the Southernization of America that becomes very clear culturally in the 1970s as like cowboy boots and cowboy hats become popular among people who never wore that shit before, and Confederate flags start showing up in the Pacific Northwest and places that are not the South. So we talk about why that happened, and Bruce Schulman's got like kind of a cultural end of it. He talks about the economic part of it, but Keri Leigh Merritt's work takes it all the way back to the Civil War and sees that this kind of like phenomenon, like things of like labor unions being very weak, things like convict leasing and the idea of prison labor. So many other like very disturbing pieces of capitalism, and in particular capitalism's kind of manipulation of race and class and power. How those things mix together in the South and how that stuff is spreading now to the rest of the country and has been for decades is really, really important and disturbing stuff. So this episode is about the South. This episode is about the history of the South, but also about how those phenomenon connect to the larger kind of understanding of capitalism, the understanding of our historical reality. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. This is Keri Leigh Merritt. Really, really great stuff, and I had fun talking to her. You can find more Nostalgia Trap stuff all over the place. If you like what we do, please think about supporting the show. We are on our own here, totally listener-supported. So any money you can throw us really helps us out. And you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. I'm not sure how you pronounce that word. patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And if you subscribe to the show, you will get access to our bonus episodes and stickers and all sorts of other stuff. Thanks for all the people who are supporting the show. I appreciate it. Please enjoy this conversation. This is me talking with Keri Leigh Merritt. Thanks so much for joining me. I mean, I feel like on this show we've had a lot of discussions lately about the Civil War and going back and talking about race and class. So it's great to talk to you because it feels like, I don't know, I guess I wanted to ask just to start us off, like, it must be kind of bittersweet to be in demand as a historian right now because there's the Civil War and all the awful racial elements of it are still very much alive. And I feel like we have, because of Trump's presidency, we're talking about Confederate monuments, we're talking about mass incarceration and race on the kind of national discussion board in a way that it hasn't been in a while. Do you feel like your perspective, I mean, I hope so, your perspective is needed? People are asking you for your perspective on Civil War and race and stuff like that because of the kind of tone of the country right now?
Yes, I mean, I definitely think so. I think for the first time in a long time, historians are starting to be called upon by the media and journalists. Of course, when I started this topic, probably 15 years ago, really, really starting to conceptualize of it, nobody wanted to touch it. Nobody wanted anything to do with poor whites I had a hard time getting funding. I had a hard time getting grants. And then this just so happened to, my book came out just shortly after the Trump election. And then, of course, a lot of attention followed that because it is kind of a new perspective on poor whites. In some ways, in some ways it differs from even the bigger selling books like Nancy Eisenberg's White Trash or something like that. And the kind of narrative that people like, conservative people like J.D. Vance put forth about kind of the moral degeneracy of
that's the hillbilly elegy guy, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I feel like so it seems like it's true then that there's been a kind of, it's not beyond just the kind of general ideas about race, this kind of specific discussion of like poor white people in America and where they fit into the larger kind of political and social history of the country. And yeah, the tone, it seems like the kind of conventional wisdom for a long time, like even with like Trump being elected, is like Trump was elected by these like dumb hillbillies somewhere. It's kind of an amazing idea because it doesn't seem like it squares with the historical reality, right?
That's absolutely true. It doesn't square. I mean, of course, poor and working class white people voted for Trump in majority numbers, but so did every other class of white people, every other education level of white people in America. College educated white women voted for him at almost the same numbers as, high school dropout white women did. So, this kind of effort by the media, specifically to recast a lot of the more racist, white supremacist parts of Trump's administration, kind of blaming that on poor and working class white people, I think, is a way that they can basically deflect their own racism. And of course, I'm not justifying the racism by anybody here, but I think it's important to realize how power is the overarching narrative here, and that the people that actually really, really benefit from racism and really benefit from keeping poor and working class white people from ever seeing that their interests, their economic interests, their labor interests are aligned with people of color many times. All of this benefits the top 1%, even the top 25% of white people. Those are the people who are economically benefiting from propagating racism. And so you could have poor whites that are completely racist. But again, the people that are propagating it, and a lot of times the people that are driving it in the media, this is Fox News. This is the alternative media that we have created and allowed to be created. That's benefiting the richest, the white elite.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it feels like, and I'm a 20th century historian, so I think a lot about like the 1960s and 1970s, but it feels like, and especially like encountering your work and encountering the work of other people that are doing things similarly, or this idea is that you got to go back to the South, you got to go back to the Civil War era, you got to go back to even before that to understand how all these relations got started. And I guess I wanted to ask, I know you're from the South, right?
I am, yes. I was born in Mississippi, but just in southern Mississippi, actually, not terribly far from where the Free State of Jones stuff happened.
Wow.
But my parents were just there going to college, and they're originally from a small town in Appalachia, and then part of my family's from New Orleans and Cajun country in Louisiana. But I've lived almost my whole life in Georgia and Metro Atlanta.
It feels like the South, just the other day, I think Trump apparently said, or the New York Times reported that he called Jeff Sessions a dumb Southerner, right? And this idea that, I mean, even embodied in someone like Donald Trump is that kind of like, Northern elitism about even racism. His idea was that the word was that it was, dumb Southerner, right? And I just wanted your reaction to that, but also your reaction to kind of how much of your, I guess, desire to study the South and study the population of like poor whites and blacks and how that interacts came from, your experiences in the South growing up?
It's a really good question. And at some point, someday, maybe I'll write something that explains all of this in much greater detail than I've ever told before. But quite honestly, I don't have a Southern accent for a reason. When we moved from Southern Mississippi, where my accent was very, very thick, obviously, up to Metro Atlanta area, kind of the Newt Gingrich district. This is back, when I was 5 years old, starting kindergarten, and pretty much everyone I went to school with was Northeastern transplant. And I learned very quickly what a Southern accent meant. I learned very quickly the perceptions that people have of you when you have a Southern accent many times, and that it's immediately associated with ignorance. And if you're white, it's associated with racism. And so, I remember as a kid just consciously getting rid of it. And part of that probably is due to my class upbringings. Although my parents did go to college, my mom is the first and only person in her family to go to college, and she grew up incredibly poor. My grandmother basically had a sixth grade education. She had to drop out to work in cotton mills and picking cotton. And probably as a teenager, I kind of realized she was pretty close to illiterate. There weren't any books in our house. Probably the only news she got was from the National Enquirer. And so, class was very apparent to me at an early age. And going back to this little mill village, literally my grandmother lived a block down the road from the mill in this old mill village house. I noticed in that little town that in the upper class and middling class sections of the town, it was completely segregated, right? All white people. But then when you got to the poor section of town, then you had where my grandmother lived, right by the mills. It was blacks and poor whites all mixed together. It could be, houses right next door to each other. And I'm not saying, again, that the white people that lived there weren't racist. They certainly were, rabidly racist in many cases, but they still live with Black people. They work with Black people. Some of them had friendships and relationships. Many of them had families together. So it was this really weird, kind of out of place situation that you never think about when you're thinking about kind of modern notions of the segregated South. But anybody who's ever been poor in the South knows that this type of interracial interaction exists.
Right.
And so when I started studying the 19th century South, I noticed that it's just completely, gone in the conversation. If people are talking about white people and whiteness, there's never any talk about what's going on an interracial level. What kind of relationships are being had outside of just completely, exploitative types of relationships.
Well, yeah, it seems like that it's more comfortable for Americans outside of the South to kind of see the white people in the South as this monolithic block. And I feel like that even applies to imagination of slavery, like in movies and stuff like that. It's always like these rich slave owners, and that's it. You see the kind of like Southern gentry kind of idea in movies and TV and stuff about slavery, and instead of a more dynamic view of what white people were like and how class functioned. It feels like that image of the South must have been something that you were seeing on movies and TV if you were aware of the accent, right?
Absolutely. And this was something that's propagated not just by Hollywood, though, but was actively created by historians. Because for so long, Southern history was written by white Southern men, right? And so they, in order for them to actually admit how many poor whites were in the South, either, under slavery or after emancipation, they were having to admit that slavery was not good, for all white people. It didn't lift all white people up, that you still had this huge segment of the population that was wallowing in poverty because they couldn't get jobs. We have brutalized enslaved labor. You're not hiring some, white person who's gonna, picket or, for a higher wage or get drunk on a Monday night and not show up on a Tuesday. You're just not doing that. You've got an exploitable labor force right there at your fingertips. Right. And so then kind of the next process of kind of historians washing this part of our history out of it came with the Nashville agrarians in the 1930s and 40s. And Frank Owsley was a big historian in particular who really argued and kind of created whiteness studies, what we know of whiteness studies today, and argued that the white South was completely solid and slavery lifted all white people up and all of this kind of mythology that we still see today.
Well, and your work intervenes on one of the more complicated eras in American history, and probably misunderstood eras in American history, which is this era of Reconstruction, right? This kind of era right after the Civil War, where there's a kind of significant national and even regional negotiation of the meaning of the Civil War and what the economic arrangements are going to be, but. Yeah, it makes me think about that position of poor white people after the Civil War and after particularly emancipation, what happens to that crew? What happens to that group? Because it seems like we're talking about a pretty large group of people, aren't we? I assume that most white people in the South at the Civil War era during that time are poor, aren't they?
Well, certainly after the war, that's true.
Yeah.
I look at the Deep South states, so the cotton-producing states, and estimate based on many, many, many recent statistical studies and this is a conservative estimate based on those studies, about 1/3 of the white population in these cotton-producing states are technically, cyclically poor. But of course, the war devastates so many people, so many small landholders, small slaveholders. Most of the South's wealth was in slave property, right? Not in land. It was in slaves. And so you take that away and people who are, middling class are suddenly poor as well. But what you see in those first few years right after emancipation it's an incredibly amazing period. It's probably my favorite period in American history, and it's still, there's so much left to be written on. But it really is both W.E.B. Du Bois and Eugene Genovese and other scholars have said that this was probably the best time in American history to have to really build a biracial coalition of poor whites and blacks and really kind of have a big labor movement. Wow. And you see these black politicians in the South who are campaigning in the early years of Reconstruction. They're drawing crowds, biracial crowds, and they're actively courting poor whites. They're telling poor whites, explaining to poor whites how policies that will benefit newly freed blacks will actually benefit them economically as well. But unfortunately, after a few years, of course, with all the Klan violence and this was an incredibly violent time. There's a realignment of race and class. Du Bois was right, basically. Poor whites start being brought into many of the privileges of whiteness, many times at the expense of blacks, and start really aligning with upper class and middle class whites. And racial lines completely harden at that point.
So you're saying that happened in a way that it wasn't happening before the Civil War, before emancipation. That
exactly.
That poor whites were. So what do you mean by this kind of like expansion of privileges that poor whites are going to start attaining after the Civil War? Why are they identifying with kind of richer white people?
Sure, and I can explain this, and I do want to stress that. Of course, they do still stay poor. Yeah. There's still a whole lot of poor whites. The South is still the poorest region in America. The Deep South, the Cotton South, is still the poorest region within that region. So, all of that doesn't become alleviated, of course, by this. But they're brought into the privileges of whiteness not only by access to land. Many poor whites are getting land from the Homestead Act at the same time that newly emancipated blacks are asking for 40 acres and a mule and not getting a cent of reparations from the government for generations of slavery. You have that. You also have the fact that there's no system of public education in the South before the Civil War, and in the Deep South. I'm sorry. There's some to some extent in the Upper South, but in the Lower South, there's none. And so after the Civil War, of course, the Freedmen's Bureau comes in and starts educating black people. Well. They're educating a whole lot of poor white people, too, for the first time in their lives, many of them. And that's actually a topic that still needs a lot of research, I think.
Yeah, that's crazy. Whenever I think of the Freedmen's Bureaus, I think of these, these kind of like local offices that are starting up. And I never think of it as I think of it as education, but I'd never considered that idea that poor whites were going to benefit from Freedmen's Bureaus. And that seems like a dangerous thing for people in power in the South.
Absolutely. They're feeding these poor whites. There's absolute starvation after the Civil War. The Freedmen's Bureau is literally holding banquets in every city and town across the Deep South, where you have just poor whites and blacks just, coming in just get a meal. And so there's a lot of interaction, and racial relations are very fluid before the Civil War. Jeff Foray is a great historian on this, but there's a whole underground economy, the kind of original black market where poor whites are trading, mostly liquor, but different things to the enslaved who are, appropriating things usually that they've raised, that they've made. Most of the time it's corn. It's almost always food and trading. And this, of course, leads to all sorts of different relationships, personal, sexual. You know,
Sure.
there's a lot. It's almost like the Old West. There's a lot of people gambling. You know, it's just constant drunkenness and revelry, and you see this across racial lines constantly. If you're really looking in kind of day-to-day records of ordinary people in the South.
That's funny you say the Old West. That's what I was imagining. It was kind of like a different, maybe like a more primitive or more informal consumer environment than you might find in like the cities of the North at the time.
Right, absolutely. I mean, and so many people say the South is kind of the outlier of the country, but at least in the mid to late 19th century, the North is really the outlier, because the West and the South probably have way more in common, you know, than the North has with either section.
Oh, that makes sense, and that makes sense that the kind of I don't know, the territorial disputes that bring the Civil War are in the West, right? You know, that's where the kind of the locus of power in the South is trying to shift, it seems like.
Absolutely, I think Jim Downs has written extensively about this. I mean, what these Northern generals are doing in the South, and how they're managing these newly emancipated plantations, how they're managing people, freed people. It's basically a first run of what they're going to do in the West with Native Americans and settlers, and how they're going to control the population, keep people down, police the population.
Wow. So, I mean, I just want to go back a little bit to your life and kind of how you came to this stuff. When did you start studying history? When did like history enter your life? I know that's kind of like a broad question, because I like to know. I mean, I was the kind of kid that was reading like the newspaper like every morning, really early, and like obsessed with history when I was really young. But then it didn't really come back until college. But at what point is history, and particularly like, I guess, Civil War history, entering your life as something that you're seriously thinking about?
Like I said, it's always been really important to me. I always kind of felt an attachment to place and the land, and something kind of deeper, more spiritual than anything I can explain.
Yeah.
And I always was reading. I've just recently kind of remembered how much young adult literature, fiction, actually drew me into it. I remember one particular book, I think it was Paula Fox, Slave Dancer,
Wow.
About actually in the Middle Passage, reading something about, and now I can't remember the name of the book, but Thomas Jefferson's daughter, who ends up, who was enslaved and then finally ends up passing for white. So those kind of books as a young adult really led me into a bigger history. And I remember going to the bookstore, probably 16, 17 years old, looking for history books on the South. And, at a Barnes and Noble or some kind of big box store, the only kind of history books there are not actually written by historians. They're written by either journalists or people who really have, some kind of propaganda to push. And
Bill O'Reilly, basically. I mean,
exactly.
If you go to Barnes and Noble in my town now, it's like, I swear, it's just the Bill O'Reilly section. It's kind of extraordinary.
D'Souza, right?
That's right. Oh God.
And
Yeah.
so, I mean, think about, my area of Georgia back in the 1990s, that if any kind of book on the Civil War was just, completely pro-Confederate, like slavery wasn't a bad thing, just completely apologist for the South. And I knew that couldn't be right. But so, and I kept wondering, well, why are all these poor white men fighting for slave property? And just kind of kept getting into it more and more in college. And I did have to work a few years in between college and grad school, but kept reading, kept studying, and very quickly realized that this was that class, I guess, wasn't really in vogue so much anymore, and that class as a unit of analysis just wasn't being used in 19th century Southern history much at all.
That's crazy. I mean, I know that. I mean, there are outliers. I feel like there are a few. You talk about like Du Bois and like Eric Foner and other historians I've come across that are talking about class, but they were like, it doesn't seem like the kinds of works you were finding in Barnes and Noble in the South at the time.
Exactly. And I should say that in the 90s. And even the early 2000s, there's some incredible scholars writing about this. Like I said, mentioned Jeff Foray, and Victoria Bynum, who actually she was the one who wrote the book on the Free State of Jones, and really started exposing all the kind of anti-Confederate and Unionist, sympathies. even in the Deep South.
What do you think changed? Why? I mean, because I don't know if you would. It seems like you would agree that class is somewhat more in vogue now. I mean, people are using class analysis to talk about all sorts of stuff, and I feel like I see it more, and that's really like I don't know. That seems like a good thing, but does it feel more in vogue to you? And if so, like why? What happened? Why are people more interested in class analysis now?
I'm still struggling with that question.
Yeah.
I think it does seem to be like a very new generation of scholars, probably under 40 years old that are really leading the charge and kind of bringing back labor history and class analysis and even some Marxists.
Yeah.
But I think for a long while, the academy was almost, pushing back so much against the kind of second wave of labor history and all the new African-American departments and women's studies departments and things like that. But also with the birth of those departments, it also in some ways kind of shattered the solidarity of, kind of labor historians being in the same department together. It kind of fragmented the movement to some extent. Because if you're studying women's history, if you're studying African-American history or any other kind of, ethnic history, you're studying labor and you're studying class. And while a lot of American history in the last 30 years or so has seemed to be, so focused on either great white men narratives or, very high level political stuff. And, it's just completely ignored the masses of people. And I think that's partly why there's not a lot of Americans reading history. It doesn't It doesn't speak to them.
It's not about them, and it's always like I think the most popular history book of the last 5 years is like Killing Lincoln. Literally like some stupid Bill O'Reilly tossed off book that he didn't even write. And we'd rather think about Lincoln. It seems like that's what people. I mean, you're a historian, and I am too, and so I know that you're always kind of battling and kind of defending the discipline a little bit. But like that idea that people think of history, Americans tend to think of history as great men still, and that idea of the looking at working class people is still seems like kind of a radical thing. It's just, I still feel like it's like you need to tell people about Howard Zinn just to start off, just to like let them know that there's another narrative there.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a big problem with all of this is the textbooks that people are taught with, kindergarten through 12th grade. The textbooks are archaic.
Yeah.
They're still mostly produced in Texas for a very specific political purpose with a very specific narrative that needs to be driven by the people in economic power. I think that whoever honestly is the next progressive candidate for president and needs to have some sort of radical platform about the Secretary of Education, just giving every kid in America a laptop or something with access to just a complete database of, all sorts of social science, history, every kind of book you want at your fingertip right there. Because if you're going to be driven, by these textbooks that are completely controlled by the people in power, you're never going to have a chance to learn real history.
Yeah, it's pretty frightening. And the stuff you hear about Texas, I feel like that almost like when northern liberals hear that stuff, that like, oh, did you hear in Texas they're taking out stories about slavery and they're changing all this in the textbooks. It almost like I think for northern liberals it like reinforces that idea again that the Southerners must be ignorant and they're trying to keep. In other words, it's again like located in the South as this idea, but it feels like something that's much more a national phenomenon.
Absolutely. And a lot of what I talk about the country today, and a lot of other Southern historians I know that when they talk about the country today and politics today, it's almost like America has become Southernized in a lot of ways.
Yep.
And from everything from just being blatantly out and out racist to labor laws, work laws, right to work, taking away unions, lowering wages. It's becoming more and more unequal. It's becoming more and more unjust, and it's hard to maintain hope.
Right. I mean, that's true, and like I'm with you on that 100%. But like I'm thinking about like That idea of the Southernization of America, I wanted to hear a little bit more about that, because it feels like, you know, that, I don't know, that even the phenomenon of like convict leasing, you know, and the idea of like mass incarceration feels like it was, I mean, if you read like Angela Davis or something like that, she tends to draw a through line from slavery all the way to mass incarceration. And
Absolutely.
is that something that you see as a Southern phenomenon that's become more national?
Yes, I argue that the South has always been way more punitive, and and I argue that it's multifaceted. It's not just the criminal justice system, which has always been more punitive than the North, but also that we have to see the criminal justice working in tandem with all of the vigilante groups that have existed, all of the people in power, even today, even if it's not necessarily called a Klan. If you got a small group of really privileged, wealthy white men in control, they're controlling everything from arrest to conviction to who's the judge, who's the jury. They're controlling everything about your chance of getting out of that system. And one of the books I hopefully we'll be able to write in the next few years or so actually really does give credence to Dr. Davis's statement, because in the South, of course, you have sheriffs and deputies, and in a couple of big cities like Charleston and New Orleans, you'll have police during slavery. But we don't have professional uniformed police forces in the South like they do in most of the northern cities and towns until literally 2 to 3 years after emancipation. And then what happens as soon as Black people are emancipated is that you see every single little town in the Deep South are suddenly getting these paid uniformed police officers to just constantly police and arrest and harass Black people.
And that begins, I mean, that's kind of an unbelievable idea. Just the idea that like you never saw uniformed cops in the Deep South until they were necessary, quote unquote, to control the Black population after emancipation. That's a crazy idea.
Right, because, I mean, under slavery, of course, most of the criminal justice system was dealing with poor white people. And many times it was poor white people who were interacting with Blacks, you know, who were socializing with Blacks, drinking with Blacks, trading them liquor, selling them liquor. Because you're not jailing, you're not, putting to death very valuable capital in enslaved bodies.
Right.
You know, you're just going to beat those people, whip them, torture them in front of all of their family and friends as a warning, and then send them back to work 2 days later. You're not losing their labor, and you're not losing your capital.
Does that because you know I've watched that was it the documentary I've used in my classes a couple times, Slavery by Another Name, that kind of takes on the convict leasing program, and it always makes me wonder, because it's a great documentary, but it concentrates obviously on the Black population. But I wonder if you came across any poor whites that were trapped in the convict leasing system too. Is that something? It seems, it seems like, because I mean, even the conversation about mass incarceration today, although, you know, obviously Black people of color are caught up in that system to a degree much higher proportionally than any other group of people, and yet there are a ton of poor white people in prison, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, Doug Blackman is completely right about, Slavery by Another Name. It's definitely used for that. But I actually have another book that just came out that I co-edited with Matthew Hild on Southern labor history, reconsidering Southern labor history. We have a whole chapter there by Brett Derby's, and it looks at what were Southern penitentiaries like before the Civil War. And what it shows, and my work has shown this as well, is that it's either convict leasing at the local level, or literally you're just having entire penitentiaries, everyone's working constantly, either making bricks, making shoes, making wagons, whatever. They're constantly laboring. And when you have these unions that are forming in the South close to the Civil War, and they're arguing against having to compete with enslaved labor, they're also arguing against having to compete with white prisoners, right? Because any kind of unfree labor is undercutting their chances of getting a job and their chances of making a livable wage.
Right. I mean, it seems like that's continued. It seems like because prison labor still exists in America, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're in the midst of one of the biggest strikes in our history.
That's right.
With the prisons right now. Yeah, I can't remember what day we're on because, of course, none of the presses are covering it at all. None of the major presses will touch it.
Oh, it's invisible in the media. I mean, I asked my students yesterday, like, do you guys know there's a prison strike going on? And they had no idea, and they wouldn't know unless they, followed particular hashtags on Twitter, which is kind of extraordinary to think about this underground thing happening right in front of our eyes, because I don't know if there's been a really major national prison strike, I mean, in history or even certainly recently.
Certainly not this big. There was one a few years ago where they attempted, and again, it was from all accounts, it was pretty brutally crushed on an internal level.
Sure.
But I mean, hopefully something will change soon. Just solidarity to all those people.
Yeah,
fighting.
I mean, I just found this website called Unicore. I don't know if you've seen that, but like there's an organization called Unicore, UNICOR. If you can look it up, it's like they're like kind of the organization that organizes factory prison labor in the United States, and there's a map on there of all the prisons and factories that employ convict labor in the United States today, and there are like a dozen in each state. I mean, it's kind of incredible. It's not something
right, and it's big. Yeah. It's big corporations that people buy from every single day. Victoria's Secret. You don't even realize because again, the media is controlled by people with a very specific purpose, right? Yeah. I mean, the media, but that's what's great though about the internet and about platforms like Twitter is that I just canceled my New York Times subscription, my Washington Post subscription.
Was it the anonymous op-ed that made you cancel?
It was actually the day before that, and they started giving me their spiel about trying to keep me, and my response is once you start calling white supremacists, you can call me and I will resubscribe. But I mean, you have so many great independent reporters, so access to publications from all over the world that aren't just written by private companies trying to make a buck in America.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's weird because it feels insidious when you see like the New Yorker, wanting to put like Steve Bannon up there as their like keynote speaker. I don't know how they thought they were going to get away with that, but like it feels like it's part of me is like, why? What are they doing ideologically? Like, what? But it seems like maybe it's just straight money. Like this is like having white supremacists and Nazis on your platforms actually brings attention and money to your company.
Right. All press is good press, and if you know how to handle a PR disaster, it's really not going to matter much. And in a few days after the storm blows over, and somebody else is the new person, being talked about. But
right.
I mean, these are big money companies. They're not doing stupid stuff. They have actuaries. They have accountants and economists telling them exactly what to do and exactly where they're going to make money and how they're going to make money. And they wouldn't do something that stupid if they knew it wasn't going to benefit them in some way.
Right, which is a really scary part about capitalism and the kind of media environment we see ourselves. And I think you're right. The internet, and I think we'll see this develop in our lives. Who knows? But like the internet as a kind of underground space is really interesting because it feels like a place where we can like, talk about and make action about things that aren't being discussed in the mainstream media at all. There's also, I guess, the danger of everyone just becoming just hypnotized by the Trump stuff. It feels like that. It feels like I hope that breaks eventually, but it feels like that's all anyone's talked about since he was elected.
It's horrible in so many ways, and I think about this constantly because I've wasted so much time, in the last 2 years. I've let so much slide. I've been so unproductive, and so many times I start hating myself and on myself of what deadlines have I not, self-imposed deadlines. What have I not done? What have I missed? But that is the whole point of one of these kind of regimes, right? It's not just to dismantle everything and do whatever they can do to make themselves richer and more powerful, but it's to really disrupt people's everyday lives. Because if you're constantly worried about what's going to happen next, and you're constantly worried about and distracted with everything going on, there's not a whole lot of room and energy for a real resistance.
Right, and there's almost like a trolling element to it, where you're just kind of constantly drawn into responding to these kind of insane, horrific things that are happening again and again, or even banal things that Trump tweeted, and we all got to talk about it.
Right.
Trump tweeted something ridiculous that doesn't make sense, and we're going to talk about it all day. It seems like a form of mind control, and I totally feel you. I feel like drawn to it on the one hand, and then feeling like it's completely wasting my time and wasting my intellect and taking my energy.
Right. I think all of us have to cut ourselves some slack and realize that, unless we're literally willing to put our lives on the line and storm the streets and take our country back, essentially, but there's not a whole lot we can do right now.
We're going to sit back and tweet
elections.
about it. Yeah.
Right. Right. So, just shut it off and try to do your work. Try to be kind to as many people. Try to help people at a local level. Try to help people, personally. And, and try to fight it that way.
God, that's good advice. I'm thinking about your studying, just to go back to you studying the Civil War and studying Southern history. I think about Southern history, in the minds of many Americans is probably like a Gone with the Wind type of image in their head, right? And like studying Southern history is almost like recovering something good about the South. But did you encounter resistance when because you actually did this PhD like in Georgia, right? Like you were in the South when you did this. Did you encounter resistance to like your kind of more complicated story, or your willingness to engage in these kind of more difficult pictures of the South?
Well, I'm starting to now. Georgia, I went to University of Georgia for my master's and PhD, and honestly, outside of a couple of people there, and quite frankly, like historically, UGA has had some really racist people there, like E. Merton Coulter, UB Phillips, these really well-known racists. I'm talking back way in the day. But, all of the professors I obviously chose to work with were very, very progressive, very racially progressive. And so I didn't have any pushback from them, but I just recently got a book review from a student and a devotee of one of the main figures that I take down, the main quote historians that I take down in my book, because Frank Owsley is the historian's name. He was the one who tried to create this Moonlight Magnolias myth of this this wonderful white South. That slavery was, didn't bother anybody. It wasn't harmful. It didn't create a much more violent society. It was just that, white people in the South were Scotch-Irish descent and wanted to have a good time, and they were honorable people who liked to fight. And I mean, it's just complete and utter bullshit, basically.
Yes.
It very much meant to create an idea of this kind of, Terra, this Civil War South of Moonlight Magnolias that didn't exist.
Yeah, and so it feels like as you're writing about this stuff, I don't feel like your work literally overturns that stuff directly. Those kind of cultural ideas, but you do the kind of social material work, historical work that does end up overturning those images, right?
I think so. Yeah. I hope it does. Obviously, history is always so much more messy and so much more nuanced than anything even historians write. But the South, particularly in the 1830s to 1860s, the Deep South, racially was there's so many more levels of relationships between whites and blacks and people of different classes even. Than have ever really been discussed.
Do you think if people understood that, what your work is about is kind of, uncovering this more dynamic relationship between poor white people and black people and the kind of ruling class in the South, do you think that how does that tell us something about the state of race in America today? Like what part of the equation are we kind of filling in by knowing that stuff and complicating that picture?
Well, I'm hoping that my work will do two things. And the first is to kind of just dispel the, proud Confederate solid white South myth.
Yeah.
That if you're a white Southerner, chances are pretty good that you were not a gung-ho, your ancestors were not gung-ho, Confederate supporters. Chances are they were either anti-Confederates and wanted to just be left alone and have nothing to do with going to war to protect, slaveholder assets, or they were Unionists I mean, there were so many different other thought processes, and even the people that actually fought, even the men that fought, there were different economic reasons, different reasons that they actually fought.
Mm-hmm.
That didn't necessarily mean that they were just gung-ho, proud Confederate Southerners. So just shattering that myth is number one. But number two, I really hope it shows people that throughout American history, again, there have always been times, there have been chances of different biracial coalitions between blacks and whites, mainly over labor and class issues. Not just during this time, but of course during populism, especially. I mean, you've got an entire, fusion government in the 1890s in North Carolina of whites and blacks governing together. And I kind of look at it on a macro level of almost every time there's a Great Recession or a Great Depression in American society, and the poor get poorer and the rich get richer. Those few years, maybe even up to 10 or so after that big recession, there's actually a chance. There's a glimmer of hope for people to really get poor enough and downtrodden enough and angry enough. I mean, you have to remember how angry and how much people have to be willing to put on the line to really go against something. Because
they have to feel they have nothing to lose. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. And then that's almost impossible if you've got a family.
Yeah.
If you've got children, that's a really hard decision to make. And I think a lot of people take that way too lightly, because many of us of our generation have not been put in that situation.
Hell no. And that's why I hate to be cynical or like pessimistic about, the kind of the hashtag resistance or whatever. But when I see people that are like Women's March and stuff like, let's go on the streets, I'm really happy about that. I was seeing those giant crowds of people in the street, but I was also wondering like, how many of those people are willing to really like lose it all to like, put their bodies on the line in a way that people in the civil rights movement did in the 1960s. I don't even see that level. Honestly, it's like, it's college students who are the only people who are or young people who seem willing to do that. But even when they do that, they get maligned and attacked by the culture, etc.
Right. I mean, it's hard to figure out what to do.
Yeah.
It really is, because and I've started talking with some community organizing groups and people from the Poor People's Campaign, and I love all of these groups, but I think the biggest challenge on the left is simply going to there's got to be centralization somewhere. We've got to have some sort of some overarching group that unites everyone and that really has a strong leadership, because right now it's all these well-meaning groups, but not an actual well-defined leadership with a path forward.
Yeah, I agree. And it's funny because we've seen things happen in the recent years, right? I mean, the just in the last like 10 years, we've seen the rise of like these kind of grassroots movements that have gained a lot of attention, from like the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, and now Black Lives Matter, and even I don't know, the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, are starting to like run candidates. I imagine the same thing as you do. But knowing the history of the left, I don't know if that'll happen. That idea of like the DSA and Black Lives Matter coming together and creating this like mega organization that like really attends to issues of race and class and how they intersect. That's amazing. That's an amazing vision, but it feels like I don't know if that'll happen.
Right, but and even so, even if it does, again, I can't tell you a single really super, charismatic, I can't tell you the leadership of either of those groups, really, right? I can't tell you who's going to be emerging as a leader, who's going to actually inspire people and really on a national level.
Right, and that always scares me, because whenever I hear someone rising up out of nowhere, I'm always, first of all, is this the one? Is this the one?
Right.
That happened with Obama, though. Like, Obama came out of nowhere, and we're like, I feel like no one in the country knew who that guy was before, about 3 months before he's in the primaries, or a year maybe. I mean, obviously people knew who he was, but he wasn't a national name.
Absolutely.
And so that led me to be like, oh, maybe this guy's the real deal. But yeah, that leadership thing is a problem. We had just watching. When you watch these documentaries about the civil rights era, you realize how many civil rights leaders were killed by the government or left the country, et cetera, et cetera. And I often ask my students, like, who are these figures today? Who's the Fred Hampton today?
Exactly.
Who's the Martin Luther King Jr. today? We don't have those figures. It's a real.
Right.
I feel lost without them in some ways. It's weird.
It is,
Yeah.
and like you said, most people think Martin Luther King. Well, there were so many others working in tandem and big, high-profile leaders.
Yeah.
Stokely Carmichael, King. King interaction created so many amazing conversations and real, theoretical, grapplings with how to make the movement go forward.
Or Fannie Lou Hamer. Yeah, she's a name that, like, when I think about how she, went to like the Carmichael and SNCC when they were first starting out and told them, don't listen to the old people, do your own thing, make your own organizations. Like I look for voices like that. I don't know if we're in a time where those kinds of voices are going to emerge. It's I think it's impossible to predict, but it seems like this is the time for them.
We need them desperately now.
One last thing I wanted to ask you about is Atlanta. Do you live there now?
Yes.
Atlanta is a place that has this kind of funny old phrase that people say about it, called the city too busy to hate. And I know that's like an old thing from even before the civil rights era, right? But what does that mean? And is it something that I guess what I'm asking is how is Atlanta different from other places in the South? Because Atlanta, I feel like, particularly in the last several years, and maybe this is part of that longer reputation. Atlanta is always seen as this very, progressive place, and from an outsider perspective, I'm talking about like from, the people in the North and outside of Atlanta, they see it as a progressive place, but also a place where, tech and industry is growing and the population is growing. It's a place that is maybe more forward looking than other places in the South. Have you experienced that? Is that something?
I definitely have. I would not live anywhere else in the South besides New Orleans, quite frankly. And I'm not talking about just, from a, do I like it here, but just politically, I would not live anywhere else. I think part of, talking about it as a progressive city is absolutely true. This hasn't been made a big enough deal, but Atlanta becomes the capital of Georgia after the Civil War because our old capital, Milledgeville, will not seat the newly elected Black leaders. And they literally can't go to Milledgeville and stay at any hotel or boarding house there. So they have to move the entire Constitutional Convention to Atlanta, where they will house Black people.
Right.
So, it is a city birthed in some ways on progressivism. Of course, it is sold this way to attract all sorts of businesses by white people in the beginning, but then increasingly by Black people. And Atlanta is different than a lot of Southern cities, at least historically, in that we've very, basically, since the Civil Rights Movement, we've had a Black government here. We've had a Black mayor and Black board, and they've always promoted Black businesses, minority-owned businesses. I would encourage anybody on a Delta flight, watch the movie Maynard, about Maynard Jackson, who basically takes our Atlanta airport, our little Atlanta airport, and turns it into an international hub for business. And this is a Black man who has made basically the biggest airport in the world, the busiest airport in the world. And Atlanta's always been a really good place for Black businesses and a Black elite, a Black upper class. But the problems we're facing now, of course, are the problems that any other city is facing: white gentrification, white people coming, flooding the city, and literally we're having major problems with not enough affordable housing.
Do you have all that modernization? So do you have like luxury buildings being built, and
yes,
it feels like that's going on in every city.
There's a lot of that.
Yeah. What about do you have like craft breweries and things like that?
Yeah, we do have some hipster parts of town, definitely. But we just elected a new mayor, Keisha Lance Bottoms, and she seems to actually be pretty progressive and already fighting back against several Trump policies and things like that. So, I'm hopeful. I love my city. Sad the Falcons lost last night, but it's a good city.
Are there? Yeah, I always think of Atlanta as a good city. I know that's a complicated thing, but are there Confederate monuments in Atlanta? Is that history there? I feel ignorant for asking.
Oh,
now.
yes.
Yeah.
No, it's all over Georgia, and of course, every state in the South, pretty much that I know of, at least in the Deep South, passed laws after they were, mostly forced to get rid of Confederate flags on their state flags. They passed laws right after that saying you couldn't get rid of Confederate monuments. So Georgia right now has a law that says you can't, not only can you not get rid of it, you can't destroy it, you can't move it, you know, all of these different things. Well, the town I live in is Decatur.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we have one right at our courthouse. And of course, these are put up right in front of the courthouses in the early 1900s. And this is actually put up in 1908 in response to the race riot in Atlanta in 1906. It's literally put up in response to the race riot.
What's the statue of?
It's actually just an obelisk, you know, with a bunch of, you know, pro-Confederate writing, you know, about like kind of the noble race and all of this stuff. And I've been an active proponent of getting rid of it. And we've actually, a panel of historians helped convince the Board of Commissioners here in Decatur to get rid of it. But we're still having major legal problems fighting the state. You know, even when we weren't going to get rid of it, we're going to move it like to the cemetery where all the Confederate graves are and move it from the courthouse and then the playground, you know, right in front of the courthouse. But literally the state of Georgia is now fighting, you know, our city.
Wow, that's kind of incredible that the historians are the ones requesting getting rid of the statue, because like so much of the kind of dumb media discourse about these statues and these monuments is that oh well, we can't get rid of them because it's history. You know, it's like taking history out. But actual professional historians are, you know, getting together and saying no, like this actually is a massive disservice to history to have these things everywhere.
Right. I mean, I went in there armed with Karen Cox's a book called Dixie's Daughters, where she outlines exactly all of these monuments are put up by the Daughters of Confederate veterans in the early 1900s to the 1920s. Basically to rewrite the narrative of the Civil War and erase slavery from any of the causes of the war.
What's with the daughters thing? Because I feel like the Daughters of the American Revolution and Daughters of Confederacy both like have this deep interest in like kind of I don't know, being ultra conservative and keeping alive these like racial myths. Daughters of Confederacy, is that organization still around?
It is, and they still fund research and give research grants to historians and things like that.
Do you have to be a like white woman to be a part of that?
I don't imagine any woman of color has ever applied, but if they have, I would love to know what happened.
Seriously, that's a book in its own. Like I'd never thought of. I mean, I thought the Daughters of the Confederacy. I've heard that phrase, but like. As a kind of active political force, that's really that's intense.
Well, I mean, think about, you know, these are all elite white women without jobs. You know, many of them have people taking care of their children. They don't have much to do, so they go around and raise money for these old relics. And we have to remember that when we're talking about any kind of racism, any kind of prejudice, that most children learn most of their racism from their mothers, right?
Yeah.
You're home with your mom most of the time. That's your primary parent.
Oh God, I'm gonna get shit on for saying that mothers are the racists.
Well, I mean, it's a sociological. You know, I mean, sociologists say that that's your first introduction to racism many times, or prejudice many times, is from your mother.
Sorry, moms. You know, there's a great book. I mean, I told you I'm a 20th century historian, so I see a lot of this stuff from the perspective of what happened in the 60s and 70s. But there's a great book by a historian named Lisa McGurr that's called Suburban Warriors. It's literally it's literally about like the rise of conservatism in Orange County in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, and it really convinces you that those kind of like those housewives that are kind of standing up for representing a very traditional idea of white, you know, racialized motherhood are kind of the shock troops of building conservatism in Southern California. And so it feels like there's a through line there from the Daughters of the Confederacy. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I would even say a modern version of it is like the Fox bimbos, right?
Oh,
I mean,
God.
They don't have a brain in their heads, but you know, if you couch it in this blonde, you know, innocent-looking white woman, you can say whatever racist filth comes out of your mouth, and it doesn't seem so threatening.
Well, that girl that's I don't even want to say her name. That girl that's going around like college campuses with a gun, you know, like and basically being like a Second Amendment warrior at Kent State University, which is so macabre to like go to Kent State with a gun. Anyone else would not get away with that. She's like a young, pretty white girl, so she gets away with like bringing an AR-15 to school as a protest. Get a black guy to go bring an AR-15.
No, have a black child.
Right.
Have a black child with a toy gun and see what happens.
Right. I mean, yeah. And that's another issue entirely that feels like, you know, we didn't get to, but it feels like your work touches on this idea, and helps explain the kind of how the trends of racism, and particularly how racism ties to capitalism, in the Civil War era, before the Civil War, and the slavery era, and afterwards, how that stuff became national trends. How we have, the ideas about black people from that era that are now, found everywhere. It must blow your mind to see. I mean, I don't know it does for me, but although I'm kind of used to it, to see Confederate flags, like even in like Massachusetts, like Confederate flags becoming like a symbol of something deeper than the history of the Civil War, right?
Right. Well, I would argue it always has been, but yes, definitely. Yeah. But I hope my work can touch on any of these things. I mean, right now, I just think we're all in probably the fight of our lives. Hopefully it won't get worse than this. And there will be some change, and at least maybe some racial healing.
Well, it feels like the Confederate monument thing is like, that's what's kind of heartbreaking about it to me in some ways, is watching people engage in this. It feels like there are a growing number of people who recognize that coming to terms with this history is important.
Yes, I think a lot of it is education. I mean, there's a lot of people that think they support it, but when you really explain to them why they're put up and when they were put up and under what circumstances, then they change their thinking a lot of times.
Yeah, I mean, I guess would you agree that the basic idea is that these aren't really like monuments of the history of the Civil War, but they're more monuments of white supremacy?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I would call them. White supremacy, not just white supremacy, but white terror. Ugh. White terror, they're put up for a specific reason, to keep black men from voting and to inculcate school children with racist propaganda to maintain white supremacy.
Yeah, I think we ought to burn all those down. I don't think we need to move them anywhere or anything.
If I had protection from going to jail for 2 years in my state, believe me, I'd be doing it right now.
Yeah. God, we have a lot of work to do, but I think we're a really, really interesting moment where this stuff is coming back. And we've said before on the show, every time we talk about the Civil War, it's like the war that never ends. And we're still very much in it. And I thanks for joining me, and thanks for talking with me.
Thank you so much.
You help us all.
I really appreciate it. I mean, it was a great conversation.
Great. Take care. All right, everybody. I want to thank my guest, Keri Leigh Merritt. I've been trying to get her on the show for a long time. I really enjoyed talking with her, and I cannot overstate how important I think her work is. So check out her stuff. Her book is called Masterless Men, Poor Whites and Slavery in the Antebellum South, and she's a really fun follow on Twitter as well. Thanks so much for listening to the show, for supporting the show. Check out subscribing to the show if you want to keep us on the air. Patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Always appreciate it. Thanks very much. We'll see you again. Take care. Bye-bye.